Hi, hello, good afternoon everyone. Thank you very much to Central St Martin's and to Judy especially for this day. It's been really fascinating for me so far to hear all the comments and thoughts from the range of speakers. My name is Will Massa. I'm the curator of contemporary fiction at the BFI National Archive. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the archive, I'm just going to give a very whistle-stop tour of it. This is our description that's most relevant, taken from the BFI's Royal Charter that I'll just leave you to read for 20 seconds with specific emphasis on the final section. Just gives a little bit of context of what we're about and what we're here to do and the extent to which dipping our toe into this area represents an evolution of our historic work. And here's a brief snapshot of the National Film and TV Collection, which is one of the largest in the world and holds a variety of formats and a variety of genres, spanning fiction films, non-fiction, a significant amount of television. We hold original camera negatives from the birth of cinema, and we collect digital masters that appeared in cinemas last week. So we really span the range of moving image work, and hopefully soon we'll be able to add here a limited but growing number of works that we would describe as immersive or emerging or even new forms, which is what we were calling them up until recently. Our strategic vision in 2022 committed us to engage with what we were then calling new forms across all areas of the BFI's activity, ranging from our programme down at South Bank as an extension of our cinema offer, all the way through to what we're looking at in the archive. I started in 2017, and no sooner had I started than I was invited to arrange a roundtable consultation with a group of practitioners who were working in these so-called new forms. So we brought together about 10 filmmakers, VFX specialists, people that were working in gaming, and we sat them down and we said, what are your arrangements for archiving personally? Or within your organisation, what would you look to an organisation like the BFI to do for you, and how can we work in partnership? And it was a very, very mixed bag response, depending normally on the scale of the organisation that the people were working in or creating from within the bigger organisations tended to have some sort of backup archival system, but it was mainly from an IP or sort of legal perspective, ranging all the way down to independent practitioners who were operating on hard drives in their bedrooms and really had no sort of formal arrangement to speak of for their work, and were starting to get very anxious about what might happen to these kinds of works given the number of moving parts that have been described recently. From there, we went on and we decided to talk to one creative studio and one independent filmmaker about their project specifically, and we entered into a pilot phase as an organisation to think about how we might go about selecting, documenting, and ultimately preserving these works, and then thinking about how they might subsequently be reinterpreted and enjoyed in the future. We're still in that pilot phase, but we selected 2 projects, and we sat down and asked them a set of questions that are strikingly similar to the ones that have been described both by the Tate and by the V&A, and it's quite gratifying to me actually to hear that we're sort of conceptually in sync organisationally with the kinds of questions that are being asked. And I find it very interesting that we're doing that, because in terms of our film and TV collection, we're building on decades of practice where we're confident in our abilities, we acquire the work, and then we know what to do with it. We don't really consult with the industry on that basis. It seems to me that if we're going to wrangle and solve some of these problems that are being raised today, or challenges, I should say, opportunities for success, then we absolutely have to do that working hand in hand with the creatives themselves. Just as an aside, I'm well aware that VR in particular isn't necessarily a film domain, that film is only one of various art forms that might stake a claim into the form. The way in which we're looking at it is as a cultural concern that has risen principally through the activity of film festivals, and I'm thinking particularly of Sundance and a little bit closer to home, Sheffield Documentary festivals. Sundance, around 10 years ago, launched a strand in its programming called New Frontiers, New Horizons, which has evolved and evolved and evolved. And DocFest has sort of concurrently come up as to be one of the principal showcases of documentary-led immersive and VR experiences. So we recognised as an organisation that this was, to a certain extent, a filmic concern. But the kinds of work that we're looking at are the ones that can be reasonably understood as an evolution of filmmaking practice. That is a moving definition, and it's not always clear, and it becomes increasingly problematic as you move into things like AR and mixed reality, where, from my perspective, at any rate, the sort of centre of narrative origin shifts from potentially from the creator onto the individual experiencing the Pokemon Go or what have you. Whereas in the realm of VR, we're still broadly, comfortably in an authored experience. So those are sort of some of the kind of curatorial definitions or boundaries that we're still teasing out. The two projects selected, one was called In the Eyes of the Animal. It's a British production that actually showcased in Sundance back in 2015 by the wonderfully titled creative studio Marshmallow Laser Feast, who I invite you to go onto their website and check out some of their projects. They're very, very interesting. And this was a project that the premise is that they're very environmentally minded. Marshmallow Laser Feast. A lot of what they do has a sort of environmental message or environmental subtext. But this is about the sort of food chain within a forest environment. So you go through 4 stages of being an animal, each one consumed by the last animal, if you see what I mean. And you can enjoy this in a number of different ways. This is played in different manifestations all around the world, and it can be a sort of fully haptic VibraPack experience, or it can be rendered just on a flat screen but manipulated with a mouse. The second, so this represents the sort of CGI-generated end of VR, and we wanted a slight contrast to that. And so we talked to a filmmaker called Jaisha Patel, who is a documentary maker. She's made some fiction, but she emerges from a short film principally, documentary maker who made, in 2016, a documentary called Notes to My Father, which is about sex trafficking in India, so quite a heavyweight, socially led, issue-led documentary. And we sat them down and we asked them various questions, and to slightly rephrase and definitely to rephrase less eloquently the point that was made by our colleague from the V&A, we were very interested to learn at what point for the creatives was the thing no longer the thing. So that's a very crude way of saying, when we start to strip away the elements that made this project unique, depending on where it was best experienced, how it was best experienced, what are the sort of thresholds of acceptability for acquisition that you would be comfortable with. Now, that's not necessarily the best way to approach this, because if we were to be consistent with our film and TV collecting, and I hope we'll get there with this, we acquire on the best possible materials that we can find, and we reproduce those materials as close as possible to the intention of the original creator. But because we're entering into this pilot phase and we're developing our infrastructure around this thing, we wanted to know, particularly in the case of Marshmallow Laser Feast, what happens if we don't collect the mossy helmet? What happens if in 20 years, if people enjoy this project, they don't do it in a woodland? What happens if, instead of taking the 8 different manifestations that this project has had around the world, we would just take a couple of indicative examples? There aren't any clear answers to that yet, and we're still in conversation with them, but those are, I suppose, the sort of curatorial quandaries and issues that we're grappling with. There are also some more immediate practical quandaries, including the way in which the acquisition of these kinds of works needs to represent a departure from our historic collections policy. We have for quite a long time now collected objects, whether they be analog materials, film prints, film negatives, preprint material, digital master files, but we haven't been collecting software and hardware, and we don't currently allow for that in our collections policy. Obviously that has resource implications, and obviously it has implications that have been raised already today about the lifespan of those of that hardware, particularly, and how often you want to update it. In our selection process, how many versions are necessary to collect in order to make the best endeavour to give the best indication of what the work was like and how it was experienced. We're also very keen, as are the practitioners that we've talked to create documentation around not only the creation of the project, sort of anecdotally, but also the ways in which it's been experienced in its different manifestations, and some sort of README instructions for how the project might be replicated, or what the best endeavour represents curatorially and interpretatively to bring that project back to life, so to speak, which feeds into the questions of future access and future interpretation. I think that's it from me in terms of the curatorial battle, which is ongoing and very enjoyable and very interesting, and we hope to be bringing more projects into the collection soon. I'm now going to hand over to my dance partner, Stephen McConnachie, to talk to you a bit more about technicals.
Thanks. Hello, I'm Stephen McConnachie. I'm Head of Data and Digital Preservation at the BFI National Archive. Never thought I'd be part of an event where the phrase, "what happens if we don't acquire the Massa helmet," was uttered. It's quite exciting. So I just got a few headlines, but I'm going to caveat my section by saying I have literally no answers. I just don't. If you came here for answers, you've come to the wrong place. So I think what I have is I'm going to really present you what this means for the BFI National Archive, given that our business has been moving image at high scale, and I'll describe a bit about that. What it means for us is a bunch of questions that we've started to explore, but I definitely have none of these are close to answered. It's quite exciting to start exploring this stuff because it's really new territory for us. As you've seen, it challenges our collecting policy. It challenges our concepts of what moving image means in our charter. If the user is creating the image, is it in scope for us or out of scope, and so on. So I wrote down some headlines when I was framing this presentation, and these are really open questions that we've started to think about. But I'll caveat this again by saying our collection is huge in the BFI National Archive, and it really is huge in two major domains, film and television. And we've built a lot of policy and capability and infrastructure to deal with mass, high-volume digitization and digital preservation. And the most pressing of those currently is videotape. All videotape carriers are obsolete functionally. There is no more manufacture of videotape. So we've given ourselves a huge scale challenge because we have hundreds of thousands of videotapes, and we're currently engaged in digitizing those and digitally preserving them. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is we've really built all of our modeling, all of our capability to deal with scale. Some days at work it feels like a factory, honestly, like a digital preservation and digitization factory. So that's it's a really jarring shift to go from that scale. Last week on one day, we ingested 450 moving image files into our system. So for me, it's quite a challenge to go from that thing to 2 case studies and solving really detailed, granular issues. So we start from that kind of shift in perspective. Data models and structures. We try to be standards facing in all of our data modeling and our documentation practice and our system architecture. And we implement a moving image data standard. It's got a really exciting name, EN 15907. We call it 15907, there's no other word for it, but its full title is Film Identification, Enhancing Interoperability of Metadata, Element Sets and Structures. It's a European standard, it's ratified in 2011, and we were the first adopters. And we've built all of our documentation principles for moving image around this. It's kind of an ontology. It deals with work, variant, manifestation, and item. It's both helpful and unhelpful for these 2 case studies. It's really helpful because it really deals well with the challenge of multi-versioning. We kind of consider the moving image work as the unfinished work. The work is an abstraction, and then it's manifested through its life cycle in 10 forms or 100 forms or 1,000 forms. And there's never an end to that. There's always the option of another director's cut. the cinematographer's cut, etc. So it's really helpful for multi-versioning, but as we found when we started to dig into it and our systems are all architected around this model, our documentation and our digital preservation. So it's good in some ways, but also it's a really rigid, it's designed for film and television, fundamentally. So it's both helpful and unhelpful. Thanks very much. Here's what it does. It describes a set of elements and defines a standard, yeah, blah, blah, blah. The key thing is a moving image work, including the various incarnations it can assume during its life cycle. And that's really helpful to model multi-versions of the thing. When's a thing not a thing? Well said. Well, what we've learned from these two case studies is there are 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 versions of each of these works. And we can choose to attempt to acquire and preserve all those versions, or we can be selective. Our data model lets us document them quite nicely, actually, and it lets us contextualize them. It lets us describe a life cycle of the work and all of its worldwide manifestations. We are standards facing also in a community. We're part of a moving image archive community. FIAF is one manifestation of that, International Federation of Film Archives. And as a community, we build cataloguing and documentation practice and digital preservation practice too. And this is the kind of Bible for our world. This is how we open it to page 65 when we need to work out how we catalogue this artist moving image or this industrial film. My hope is that I can engage the FIAF community who are also interested in collecting the new forms in our moving image world so that we can solve these problems collectively. How do we use our traditional moving image documentation practices to solve these new opportunities for success? If you're interested in this, by the way, you can look it up at filmstandards.org. It's used by most of the big national film archives in the world, the French and the Germans and us and some North Americans, and increasingly it's being used by most moving image archives. And those are the entities. So we looked at our data model and our system architecture and structure, and we thought it's both helpful and unhelpful. How about terminology and taxonomy? So we talk about a moving image work and we talk about manifestations. And here's where we really realized that all of our models are rigid and very inflexible in describing this new world. And that poses us a challenge because if we're trying to be standards-based in our documentation and there is no standard to use, what do we do about that? And as I said, I have literally no answers. But we're talking a lot about it as we speak, and we're working out what would it mean to acquire 2 case studies. And I should say we have 1.5 million objects, moving image objects in our collection. So you can really overkill your system change for 2 objects. And we might acquire 10 more in the next 5 years. We might acquire no more. So we have to tread a really fine balance between breaking all of our standards and models and architecture and for 2 case studies, or don't do that. Instead, make a best endeavor. So use the work and the manifestation, break it slightly, use text fields instead of our controlled vocabularies. So that's where we're at. How can we use our systems and our data models for 2 case studies without overkilling it, and yet make them retrievable and meaningfully described? Another headline is we have built very big infrastructure to deal with mass, high-volume digitization and digital preservation. We have 3.5 petabytes of data in 3 years. We grow about a petabyte a year. We record 17 channels of television off-air every day, and we automate the recording and the documentation and the preservation. So we're really good at building that big factory of moving image stuff, and it runs infinitely, quietly, humming. But the way we've built our systems is to achieve that. It's not to achieve the complexity required here. And we visited the Tate, and Jack and Tom and Patricia at the Tate showed us the way they deal with their acquisitions, and it really made me realize we have built our systems to achieve scale, huge volumes of predictable things. So this is a massive challenge for us. We're very good at huge volumes of predictable things. We're very poor, I've realised, at low volumes of very, very unpredictable things. So this is a big change for us. And I thought I'd write it down, make myself feel better. We can document any object, really. We can break our taxonomy, we can use controlled vocabularies, or we can use text. And we can store any bits, and we're used to storing huge files. Some of our 4K feature films are 6 terabytes. That's a single film. We're good at that. And we store many files. We have 180,000 television programs a year flying into our system. So solved problem area. We can migrate them from tape A to tape B, and we can retrieve them bit perfectly. And the bit perfect is built into all of our processes. Great. And we can decode basically all moving image files. I mean, thanks to FFmpeg. I wrote all, and then I thought, that's a bold claim. Just maybe say basically all. And we can render that stuff on a flat screen at scale quite efficiently. We've built it at cost-effective solutions. But those things are all constraints also. They're very good at delivering our core thing. But they're also constraints at dealing with tiny, unpredictable, we're really good at this stuff. 450 things going in a day, and lots of stills, 1.5 million stills digitally preserved. But really, we need to break that factory approach and zoom in on very few unpredictable cases. So that's our challenge. So then, digital preservation, safeguarding this stuff so it persists through time. And I made the slide, and I was going to fill it with stuff. I suddenly felt very Glaswegian and pessimistic and depressed, thinking, what can I put on here? We are literally dipping our toes in this pond. And I channeled my Glaswegian and then cheered myself up by going back to basic principles. And I always go back to the NDSA. And I know there's many maturity and capability modelling experts in the room, not least William. But I like to go back to NDSA when I feel a bit lost and swamped and confused and stressed, and then you can make a list and you can say, well, I'm starting on the left, and we might eventually get to the far right, but let's start on the left. And it made me feel better, and I think in some of these areas we can bit perfectly preserve these 2 case studies acquisitions in every version and document them, but we don't have a policy that lets us preserve hardware. And we don't have a policy that lets us do some of the deep research and analysis that Jack and Tom have described. So really the bottom row, I think, is where our capabilities and our confidence in these 2 case studies starts to, shake, crumble. And then I thought about the next version of NDSA, which is likely to incorporate access. I don't know how much of you are into NDSA and digital preservation, but there's a group of people working on augmenting it with an access capability and maturity. And this really is where the dipping the toes becomes an uncomfortable place to be, because I can preserve the bits that Will has acquired, and I can document the versions and the context. I have no real, currently in our infrastructure and our capability, even in our policies, I have no possible chance of delivering reuse and access to those things, even in 1 year, let alone 10 or 20 years. So this is where I start to feel less secure in our capability, in our position. And back to the mossy helmet. What happens if we don't acquire the mossy helmet is definitely my favourite takeaway from today. And then I was talking to Rebecca this morning, first thing, and in her presentation she talked about the Wild West that we're probably in, and how she described a few years ago it was all about producing the content, now it's about distributing the content. And it feels a bit Wild Westy to me. And then I considered this. The BFI recently put on an event at the IMAX for Victorian large gauge, 68mm Victorian film. And next year we're going to publish those online, not only the large gauge, but all of the available, held, extant Victorian era film. And there's over 700 works. So we definitely have lost films, there's no question. We definitely have saved quite a lot of those films. And I started to think, how come we managed to save those? The first film archive we know about was the Imperial War Museum, I believe, and I think it was founded in 1917, so 23 years after the first films were being made. And the BFI followed later, 1935, and we have managed to save quite a large volume of films made in between 1895 and 1901. So that led me to believe that maybe saving the bits, even though we haven't solved all of the challenges of access and runtimes and standardization of runtimes, maybe saving the bits and keeping them safe and documenting the versions in the context is a good first step. So, as I said, I got no answers, but that's where we're at in the BFI. We're trying to shift from being a traditional film and television archive to deal with high volume, to zooming in on very, very unpredictable, low volume, complex objects. And that's it, I think.